Welcome to today's web conference. Today's topic is advising an ageing population. It's a huge topic and I'm happy to be joined today by Graham Duffy from Partnership, Ivan Willerton from APS and Andy Woolen from Zurich. Today we're going to be looking at the market around the aging population, looking at some of the barriers to entry, some of the challenges for advisors, some of those emotive challenges for families considering this very important but sensitive topic, and also some of the innovations in that market. And Graham, if I could start with you, would you just give a bit of a summary of the kind of headlines that you'd like to share with our advisors today?
Yeah, it's an area that I've been involved in through Partnership and as was PAFS before that. For 17, 18 years I've been doing the actual care part of it, working with advisors, helping them get qualified, etc. And we just see that the potential's been there for many years. And I think the Care Act will help some of that because they do actually mention, perhaps not as strongly as we would like to have done, but regulated financial advice. Mm-hmm. And I just think that financial advisors with the qualification can really make a big difference to individuals. Either planning ahead of the care need, or even at the point of need. Obviously, we have our product for immediate needs, immediate needs annuity, but it is all about advice. It's about advising clients, getting them ready for the problem. Looking at property, severing tenancies and things like that. There are certain things that you can do to plan ahead. You've got to be a bit careful about giving assets away because you've got the thing called deliberate deprivation. But again, advisors that have got knowledge of this market can help those clients, decide what they're going to do. And then just really try and preserve as much capital as possible. One thing you've got to watch is that if you are somebody that's used to a reasonably affluent lifestyle, is if you do manage to get rid of everything and you don't have to pay and you're in the hands of the local authority, you may not be in the nicest home in the area. So you've got to be aware of that. If you're happy to pay a certain amount for your care, and London and the South East, you're probably looking at 40,000 a year and upwards for anything half decent, then that's what you're going to have to pay. So I think advisors can really make it does boil down to money. It is a cost factor. It is finance. So financial advisors, I think, are the ones that can really help potential clients in this area, and help the state by stopping people running out of money, etc.
Yeah. So Andy, from your perspective, just a couple of headlines. We've got about an hour today. And again, what we're looking for, of course, you're driving this conversation, so advisors able to ask questions about any topic around this huge subject. But again, what for you do you think are the hot topics that we're going to pick up on?
I think there's something, I'm just sort of stepping back a bit further really, and I think because of UK PLC and the debt that they're trying to balance the books, one of the things that we're seeing the government doing is there's this sort of active transfer of risk and responsibility from things that the state have traditionally taken care of for individuals, and certainly the current age generation will be of that mindset that the state will look after me. And what they're doing is to reduce state costs and to try and balance the books, is they're transferring across this risk and responsibility onto individuals themselves. And my first question is, how many individuals realise that that's the case? I would suggest not as many as should do. But what are the sort of things they're transferring across? Well, very clearly, as Graham's alluded to, there is the long-term care costs, although, as we now know, the long-term care cap of £72,000 is being pushed back to at least 2020. But beyond that, there's other responsibilities. You've now got healthcare before you get into older age, protection, of course retirement income. So we've seen this not only with auto enrolment, sort of making the individual subsidise their pension as opposed to the state with the state pension changes and pensions freedom and choice. But also we're seeing this with the focus on tax as well. And one of the areas that affects the aged population far more is that of Iht Planning, despite some of the messages that have been coming out recently, and I'm sure we'll touch on that later. And I suppose at the end of the day, with the headlines that are coming out that paint a very positive picture, they can be very misleading. And when we actually look at the detail underneath it, and many of the advisors will know that detail, actually the reality is quite different. And I think that the need for professional advice for later life planning or aged population is absolutely paramount to make sure people know what direction they're going in and can have a fruitful and enjoyable later life, really.
And must be increasing, as you said, set out in the Care Act. Yeah. Ivan, from your perspective, how are you finding that? Are you collaborating with advisors and supporting advisors through the APS proposition now? What sort of themes are coming out?
Yes, we are. I mean, in APS, we believe that there's other aspects of financial planning which are entirely relevant to an ageing population, and we provide, estate planning, will writing, and probate services to advisors and our associates. So it's not just perhaps the later care costs that need to be borne in mind, as the colleagues have just said, but there are those other aspects of financial planning which are really, really crucial and an important and an integral part of holistic financial planning. We have an ageing population. I think it's estimated now that there's over 23 million people in the country, in the UK, that are aged over 50, and that's over a third of the UK population. So we're not only seeing, as Andy said, this shift of responsibility to the individual, but we're seeing more people, going through into this later stages of life. And from a financial planning perspective, it's really, really key that the clients get the correct and appropriate advice at various stages of their life on their journey towards that later life.
And how, when we're thinking about perhaps younger clients, why is this still so relevant for them in that consideration?
Well, it's never too late, in my belief, and it's never too early to start planning for the future. And myself, for example, let's say someone in their 50s, I have elderly parents in their 80s, so they are already at a situation where potentially there might be a care need, but equally, people in their 30s or 40s, would themselves have parents or grandparents that they're already experiencing, care issues, and things around pensions. People come, their parents perhaps that are coming up to retirement, and with the advent of pensions freedom, that's opened up a lot of opportunities about how people are going to use their money at or in retirement. But they've still got to think about ultimately later care life costs as well.
Okay. Today we're going to touch on the implications of the Care Act more specifically, and talking about what that means for clients and carers. We're going to just cover off some of those sensitive issues and just how advisors can support families, what sorts of hurdles they're going to have to overcome. And there's a very emotive as well as a fact-based kind of dynamic to this, which I think we should touch on. We'll talk about the lasting power of attorney, and we're going to talk about estate planning, IHT, and some of the product innovation that's happening in this market. Again, things like intergenerational wealth and considerations, pensions freedoms, and how those things are drawn together. So again, at any point during this session, drop through questions and we'll be happy to sort of knit them into this debate. I guess in the meantime, ahead of questions, let's talk about what are some of the considerations and the barriers that an advisor might face when thinking about moving from maybe advising on the accumulation phase to looking at at retirement, later life, and maybe that intergenerational transfer. I'll start with Greg.
Well, I think specifically on the care side, which is the bit I deal with, you don't tend to be dealing as an advisor with the elderly person that needs the care. You will be dealing with their powers of attorney that you mentioned, and I would say that's the case in probably 95% of cases that certainly come through to us for those that apply for the care annuity. I don't think it's an area that you mentioned earlier. It's a very sensitive area, and obviously people are going through a very emotive time. If you've had a situation where you were with mum or dad, one weekend, and they were there out doing the garden, very happy, and everything's going okay. Suddenly something happens, and care can arise in different ways. It could be a sudden thing, or it could be a gradual deterioration. But if you then, hear during that week, the course of that week, that they've had a fall, or they've had a stroke or something, and they're in hospital, and you imagine the sort of stress and strain of that. So everyone concerned is put through a lot of, and they're probably not used to dealing with that. They're not used to having to deal, other than perhaps throughout their life going to see their GP, so they haven't had hopefully too much dealing with the NHS, probably haven't had any dealing with local authorities other than complaining about their council tax. So then they're suddenly faced with this, what do we do? Yeah. The hospital are saying they want to discharge mum. We've been to see these care homes, there's some in our area, some of them are £1,200 a week, it's just incredible. And we're told that mum will have to pay or mum or dad will have to pay because they own a property, they've got investments and things like that. So it's just incredibly stressful, for those people. So I just think it's something that, as I mentioned at the beginning, advisors, I think they can really get to grips with this market. We reckon that it's probably a bit high now, around about 10%-ish of those that self-fund their care actually take regulated qualified advice around their care funding, which I think is woefully inadequate. Now, not everybody will take advice around that care funding, but for 10%, I think there's a long way to go in terms of reaching the right number of people.
And when you think about the Care Act and how it sets out effectively the requirements and the entitlements, how it seems that it's quite structured to support advice. So that 10% is likely to grow. Yeah,
I mean, as was mentioned earlier, but only part of the Care Act has come into effect in April this year, and that is the new national eligibility criteria. So rather than individual local authorities setting their own criteria, they all have to use the same. I think all of this is subject to an element of subjectivity anyway. And also things like the carers' rights that's been brought in, and also the new deferred payment scheme. I mean, the government said no one would have to sell their property. It's always been around. Well, for many years it's been around, but it wasn't mandatory on local authorities to offer the deferred payment scheme. Now they do have to offer it if you meet the criteria. So if you've got other assets of more than 23,250, you won't meet the criteria. So basically they have to offer that, but they can charge interest now and arrangement fees and setup fees and things like that. As far as the main part, the financial part, if you like, of the Care Act, the cap has been deferred, as was mentioned, till at least 2020. Question mark, will it actually ever happen? I don't know. I just really don't know on that one. And also the increase in capital limit from 23,250 up to 118,000 has been deferred. And a thing called first party top-ups, where you can use your own money to top up to be in a better quality home. That's also been deferred. So, but one good part about it is that they do refer to getting information and advice, and they refer to financial advice, and they refer to being regulated through the FCA. They talk about it is fundamental to help people decide how they'll pay for their care. When they talk about some of those other aspects that clients must consider, it's use of income and assets, deferred payment scheme, all those different bits. To me, that is regulated activity, and that's got to come from a regulated and qualified financial advisor. And charities, don't get me wrong, charities have got some fantastic information out there, fact sheets, and all those kind of things which are incredibly useful. But how do you make sense of it all in this stressed out situation?
Absolutely. I also think there's there's been quite a lot of misleading headlines out there. So, when the cap was being talked about, there was regularly press headlines saying it was £75,000. Obviously, we know it was going to be £72,000, now delayed. I think the other thing is that a lot of people thought, great, I'm only ever going to have to pay up to £72,000. Of course, the devil's in the detail. On top of that, you have to pay hotel costs, accommodation costs, which are sort of capped at £12,000 a year. If you want to be in a better care home than the one that would be funded by a local authority, there's top-up costs. None of that's included in that £72,000. And I think if you look at the sort of average age that people would typically spend in a care home, sort of between about 2.5 years, you'll find that very few people will ever benefit from the local authority funding the care over and above that £72,000. I think the figure that's been quoted is only about 10% of people or less will ever benefit from the cap, should it ever come in future after 2020. So, over and above those misleading headlines, people need advice to know what are they going to do. So, as we said, absolutely crucial.
And the cost in retirement could radically change based on a fuller understanding of those details. And the interplay between, thank you Barry Spencer, the interplay between the retirement and investment advice and long-term care, how those two things interact with each other, maybe sometimes compete with each other. Just talk about where the grey area might be between those areas.
Personally, I think rather than have separate pots of retirement planning advice, Iht planning advice, later life costs, long-term care cost advice, I actually think there's just one advice bucket, which is later life planning. So from the point, let's say age 65, for argument's sake, I know state pension age is going back, but from that point onwards, rather than it being it's just about the later life planning. Whether that's income whilst you're in reasonably good health, enjoying retirement, whilst it's about planning for maybe when your health deteriorates and you need to change that, or whether it's about passing on the assets in an efficient way, I think all those things are inextricably linked. And in the same way as when we're talking about pre-retirement planning, we talk about having assets that are going to accumulate, and then we're talking about assets for decumulation and income. I think it's pretty much the same in later life. So I think I think there's a lot of benefits for advisors as well as clearly clients, because not only will you be talking to the clients themselves, but you may also be dealing with their adult children, because they're going to be involved in some of the decisions. When perhaps the clients do pass on, the assets will pass to those adult children that you've already built a relationship with, so you'll keep the assets under advice, and then you may start advising their children. And generational planning can then not only be more fulfilling for you and the clients themselves, but it can also be far more valuable, because you're not having to go out and incur costs of getting new clients, new business, that type of thing.
I guess sort of open question then, yeah. So
Yeah, I mean, I think the question was the interaction between investment advice and later life advice, and I agree. You know, with Andy there, is that you know, it's any advice given to a client is for their later life, whether it's investment, pensions, or long-term care planning. You know, so they all sort of mix together, so to speak. And you know, there is this sort of well, there has been certainly a concept that, you know, the state will look after me in later life. Well, it won't. As we referred to at the beginning there, there's this shift, this onus onto the individual to put sufficient and adequate plans in place for them to be looked after in later life, whether it's by their own means, you know, or through their family. And I also agree, you know, that intergenerational, you know, financial planning is really key as well, because you're dealing not just with your client, but you're dealing with the family, and the family are there with the client when they do reach that later life, and it's really, really key, you know, that kind of succession of advice takes place as well.
I think that's very important in terms of, there are a lot of people out there that perhaps in their 50s, 60s that have parents that are 80s, 90s even, or even over 100 in some instances, but those people in that, they're actually expecting an inheritance from mum or dad. Now, if that person then needs full-time care in a care home that's costing 40 or 50,000 a year, you can see that inheritance eroding quite rapidly, and that's not a nice position for anybody to be in, because how is your mind going to work in terms of, I'm relying on that inheritance and I can see it being eroded. So, you know, you mentioned earlier it's never too early or too late. So, and I think the problem as far as the product that we have, for instance, is that people don't think there's anything you can do. You need full-time care and that's the end of it. But, you know, you can, with help from a good advisor, you know, look at different options, and perhaps, you know, a cap on the cost of your care through an annuity might be the answer, just to bring you that certainty and peace of mind.
Yeah. There's such a spectrum of considerations and aspects to this. From an FCA permissions perspective, if, for example, you've spent your life and you built your business in the wealth management space, how big a step is it to actually start to take, as you say, having that one advice pot? What's the step to be able to really genuinely help clients across that spectrum from an FCA permissions perspective, as well as just from an education perspective?
Well, I think, go on.
Well, I think it needs to be done. You know, I think any self-respecting, you know, financial advisor, you know, we talk about holistic planning, but you know, we really need to look at the whole gambit. You know, the whole sort of you know, spectrum of advice. And it's a duty of care, it's a responsibility as any you know, advisor to sort of look at everything, you know, leading to that later life. Andy?
I was just going to say, you know, depending on the quality, it's about qualifications a lot of the time. So, are you authorised to give advice on long-term care planning? Are you a solo advisor? That depends. That's from two aspects. One, that's about having the knowledge, but it's also about the product, some of the proposition or product recommendations you can make. There are some propositions that are coming into the market now that, although they still undoubtedly require the knowledge of the later life market, from a regulatory perspective, you don't need to be authorised as a later life planner. You can do it through just your normal ICOB regulations, because there's some protection products out there now that give options. As the one that we've been piloting, the later life option, that allows you to take a big proportion of the sum assured if you meet a certain criteria, because you've had to go into suffered certain illnesses or go into certain levels of care. So the market is developing to help advisors with that, both in terms of the propositions, the products, but also in terms of the knowledge.
If you're looking for support to really understand how you extend into this market, apart from reading the Care Act cover to cover,
Nice bit of bedtime reading.
yes, what other kind of sources and resources are available for somebody that's seeing that this is coming? It's clearly affecting all clients, isn't it? As you said, from an intergenerational perspective, but there is quite a lot to learn, isn't there, to really get to grips with this subject.
I mean, there's a range of seminars that take place. Solo operates seminars. I think some of the solicitor firms operate seminars. One of the recent PFS set of road shows we're talking about later life as well. And providers and distributors put on different events that, apart from being CPDable, have experts brought in that can talk and educate on this. So I think if it's an area you want to get into, it's a case of attending one of those, and obviously something like today's web conference is just a starting point of that, as well as some of the various articles and keeping abreast of what's going on in the market. And I suppose the trick is, as ever, is if you've got a set of clients which are in a certain age cycle and maybe they're starting to think about this, is just talk to them about it, have a conversation, see where the conversation takes you, see what barriers you come up against, what barriers, issues you've got to overcome, see what gaps in knowledge you've got, and then go back, further upskill in that knowledge and see. And if it's an area where you think it could be beneficial for the clients and beneficial for you and help take your business in a different direction, it's an area to definitely just get involved in. And certainly I think the evidence has been that for the advisors that have moved into this area, and I've certainly got a couple in mind that I've spoken to in the past, it's been a turnaround in the business, because it's been less about getting new clients. It's been more about managing those clients on a much longer basis, getting to know them closer, broadening the relationship, getting recommendations through the family line, and it's been good business for everybody.
And I think you mentioned Solar, and Solar have got regional coordinators now. So you can get into your own region and go and find out a bit more what it's all about. Go to some of those courses that are run locally, so you don't have to be necessarily coming to London and things like that to get to those courses. So that could be really useful through that. So they just need to log on to the solar.org website to look those up. Just one thing I'd caveat about the whole, I sort of agree with you about this. The whole thing is being looked at as one and holistic advice. The only thing I would say is that I've found, and having dealt with advisors over many years, specifically on the care bit again, is that there are some advisors that have got into that market and just said, I just find it's a bit too stressful for my liking. The families are very stressed, and they're perhaps not thinking logically. So it is not for everyone. It's not a market. That final part of it, the long-term care bit, because it is that kind of thing. You're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. And so some have tried it and thought, I'd rather actually refer these cases to someone that specialises in it and thrives on it. And I think that's a much better way to deal with it. You know, if you don't particularly feel comfortable with it, you're better off referring it, because then you perhaps wouldn't do as good a job as you normally would if you don't feel comfortable with something. Yeah. So I think that's what advisors need to do.
Yeah, that's a good point, Graham, because I mean, as we touched on earlier with the implications of the Care Act, it can potentially be a complex area, in terms of the ramifications of the Act and how it impacts on clients. So, for clients to get good, proper advice about the later life planning, they need to be speaking to someone who knows the detail. And I do agree that there's facilities available to sort of get deep into the subject, to acquire extra knowledge, to give that advice to clients. And if you choose to do that, then great. But if you don't, then at least you pass them on to someone who does and is properly equipped and qualified to do so.
I think there are some advisors that are fantastic. They can get any exam in the world and they can be chartered and all this. But when it comes to that, it's part of Solar is around the soft skills, how you're dealing with people in this very stressed situation. So if you're just not comfortable, you may be brilliant and one of the best advisors in the world, but you can't just deal with that final bit on the care side.
And I suppose one example of where you get to a point you think, that's not something I want to deal with, I need to hand off to an expert, is probably where they get to a point of thinking about doing a lasting power of attorney.
Yeah. I mean, I'm obviously a great believer in people should have wills, but 40% of people or so estimated have wills, but probably only about 1% of the population have a lasting power of attorney. And that's really, really crucial in people's sort of later life planning. But it's often not something that's thought about, perhaps by financial advisors or indeed the clients themselves. There's a great important aspect to build into this holistic financial planning. And let me give you an example. Is that we've talked about pensions freedom since that started a while back. But if a client has a pension pot, whether it's already invested or in drawdown, if that person loses the capacity to make their own decisions about that, then where are they left? Well, they're left in a bit of a sticky spot because someone might have to go and obtain deputyship through the Office of Public Guardian, which is difficult, time-consuming and expensive. But if they have a power of attorney in place, then someone can make those investment decisions, those drawdown decisions on behalf of the client. And that's something that, certainly we at APS firmly believe is something that a lot more clients should be thinking about, being advised about by their financial advisors, and then doing something about it.
And when a pension's in drawdown and that the LPA is not there, then what are the consequences for the income, and then by extension what are the consequences for long-term care financing and so on?
Well, like I said, really, decisions have to be made, and if those decisions can't be made until some authority is obtained, then it's sort of in limbo, I suppose, really.
The decision has to then be made effectively through the court-appointed deputy through to the Court of Protection. Yeah. And as you say, it's time-consuming, costs money, and it's just a nightmare to deal with. So.
Yeah. But if people have thought about it early enough and built in lasting power of attorney around their property and financial affairs, because there are two types, of course, and that's one of them, that if they've got that in place as part of their financial planning, as and when it's needed, it can take effect.
I think, I don't know whether it's an English thing, but people don't like to have conversations with their parents about what do you want to happen when you pass on? So with the will or the funeral plan, which is why I think you said only 40% roughly of people have got wills in place. Yeah. I refer to a lasting power of attorney as like a lifetime will. Yeah. People don't have a conversation until they have to, which is by that point it's too late. So I think almost as a nation, but certainly as financial advisors and financial providers and distributors, we need to overcome some of that, help clients overcome some of that emotion of having those conversations, especially given that if you don't have it, by the time it's too late, the state's not going to support you and you're going to be left having to sort it out yourself. So, a stitch in time saves nine and all those other analogies, but I really firmly believe that people need to start thinking about it and doing it quicker.
Let's talk a little bit about the two different types of LPA and just, again, when would be appropriate to have something like that put in place in order that you're not constrained at the point of need, which I think is your point.
Yeah.
Well, like I said earlier, no time is too early, but certainly, because when someone becomes incapacitated, it can be through dementia, for example, but equally it could be something like as a result of an accident. So it's not necessarily, as a result of getting into later life. But two types. One of property and financial affairs that enables an attorney to make decisions about basic things like bank accounts, but for further reaching things like pensions. And then the other one is health and welfare. So someone given the authority to look after and make decisions about someone in terms of their care. And that's really important as well. But they do. You can't get a combined one. You have to have one of each, so to speak. So it's equally important to have the health and care one as well as the financial one.
That's great. So the question in from Simon Hale. Thank you, Simon. If and when the potential cap comes into effect, circa 2020, and we'll talk about the political significance of that in a moment perhaps, do you think it will apply to both people already in care and also new claims cases after that time, or will it just be the latter? So in other words, will there be a level of retrospection?
No, well, when the cap, if it was due to come in April next year, and the clock only started ticking from April next year, that was the intention. So the clock will only start ticking from April 2020 as soon as it comes in. So whatever you've spent on care, if you've been in care for 5 years at that point, none of that counts towards it. Is that the point? I'm not quite sure. And if it's a couple, you each have your own care account.
Okay.
So your care, husband and wife, each one will have their own care account. The clock's up, so the meter's running based, as was mentioned earlier, based purely on the physical care that you're having, not hotel accommodation living costs. and only at the rate of the local authority. So there's a big cross-subsidy from private to local authority. So each one would have their own care account, and whenever each individual reached that £72,000 cap, or whatever it's going to be in 2020, then the local authority would step in and pay just for the care costs, not for the hotel living costs. So you're still going to have ongoing self-funding costs, assuming you've still got capital left at that point.
And let's talk about that, because there's quite a significant difference, isn't there? It's quite a miserable onion here with the different layers of it. So let's talk about what those top-up costs and just paint that picture of what a couple might be facing if they're both actually sort of advancing in years.
Well, I think you could be looking. I mean, I mentioned, I think right at the beginning, that if you're looking London and the South East, you're probably, for anything reasonable, anything comfortable and nice and what you'd be expecting, if you've had a reasonably affluent lifestyle, 40,000 a year and upwards. So if there's two of you, you're then looking at, okay, you'd probably have some kind of room, where you get so you might, but it still could be 60, 65, maybe 70,000 per year. So that's a huge amount of money.
Of course, there's the other point, which is, even though let's say that's coming in at, just to make the maths easier, £1,000 a week. That might be what the home costs, but the cap is only based upon what the local authority would pay towards a care home. So if their limit is only £600 a week, that's all that counts towards the cap as and when if it comes in. The extra 400 quid in that example would be self-funded. If plus on top of that you've got your £12,000 a year accommodation costs as well. So you can see how even if you did eventually get to that level of the cap, you still would be contributing a significant amount by the side.
And if you've made that decision prior to the cap being in place, then, which I think is perhaps to Simon's point, is you could make decisions now that mean that £600, for example, is that you can't see that the cap is all going to be covering.
I don't believe it's going to be retrospective. The reason they said they've pushed it back and delayed it is because they can't afford it. No. Therefore, by delaying it, they're delaying the non-affordability of the cost, so I don't believe it will be retrospective at all.
It's interesting that my understanding is the local authorities actually only requested a delay of maximum 2 years, but the government said, well, we'll just delay it by 5 years. So why would they do that unless there was it's election year, I think, as we kind of mentioned earlier. So what is going to happen with that cap is 5 years away.
There's a challenge here, which is things aren't certain. And that normally leads to a bit of a planning blight. And what we're saying here is that people find that the families, the individuals, find this a difficult subject to tackle. So, I guess what sort of advice would you give about what things to look at? Where can you act now with confidence?
I think where you can act now with confidence is speak to a financial advisor and start doing some proper planning. It's a bit like a lot of things in life. So if you're planning on buying a house, you will start planning over a number of years towards saving up a deposit, towards looking where you want to. And even though the reason people don't do planning for later life care or long-term care is because they don't believe it's ever going to happen to them. A bit like I said earlier, it's a bit like the critical illness argument, it never happened to me. But what if it does? Then suddenly you're smack bang into this difficult situation that we've just mentioned. So, if you start doing some planning towards it in case it happens, and whatever route that might take, then at least you're planning for success, if you like, as opposed to planning to fail. Yeah. And I think, we can't say it enough, that's why you need to take advice. If you do nothing, nothing's going to happen until it's too late. And at that point, you will be pushed into a corner, which is it will either use your savings or it will go as a debt against the home, and that will then have implications maybe for your children, your descendants who won't inherit the home or may inherit some debts. So,
How can you help? Again, this planning blight, in a sense, this pause. How do you help somebody that has the need but doesn't have the insurance, hasn't taken that early action? Is there anything that you can do, or is it the lost generation?
So I have a certain view that the aged generation at the moment, the people that may be in their early to mid 70s who haven't done any planning at all, and who are maybe of the traditional mindset, the state will look after me, it's pretty much too late, is my view. Apart from the default options of maybe equity release, the debt against the house, the savings, if they've got that type of stuff. In terms of planning, insurances will be very expensive, so there's an affordability issue there. There is the immediate annuities that Graham mentioned. I think where the generation is, it's the pre-generation. So it's the people, the adult children now in their 50s to 50s, those that have either been through this with their parents and realised how difficult it is on all of the factors we've mentioned, those that don't want to be a burden on their children because they've realised what it was to go through with their parents. Maybe they're knowledgeable enough to know that the state is retracting its support. They're going to have to be self-sufficient going forward. People are living longer. All these factors in recognition that they have to do something and they don't want to be left in that. And maybe just even, they like to take control of their affairs. But I think that's where the focus is. And the earlier you start with this, and whether it's going down the protection-based route, which Zurich is piloting, whether it's going down long-term care insurance routes, whether it's doing LPAs, or starting early enough gets time on your side, it gets age on your side, it gets health on your side, and it spreads the cost over a lot longer period. And that's the key thing that we said, it's about the cost of it. The longer you can spread it, the better. And I know there's lots of competing things for costs nowadays, pensions being one of them, and other things, but there are solutions that when you dovetail them together can meet both needs.
But advice can still be incredibly helpful, even at that point of need, if you've done nothing about planning. Because a lot of people will say, I think you mentioned earlier, it's not going to happen to me, I'm not interested in that, don't talk to me about it. So it's a very difficult subject to broach anyway. But the advisors that are qualified and especially solar accredited, perhaps they'll look and say, well, actually, because there is a possibility, albeit somewhat remote, but it can happen, that the NHS perhaps should be funding that person's care. A thing called NHS Continuing Healthcare. And it does mean that if you meet the criteria for that, quite difficult to get it, but if you meet that criteria, it does mean your care is fully funded. And they don't, not just the cost of the room or anything like that, it's actually the whole cost is met. So advisors that have got knowledge in this area will say, actually, I think your mother or father's you've got to be in quite a bad way to get that. But they might say, we think you should, speak to the local clinical commissioning group and see whether you can get it funded. Because that could be the difference between paying out your £1,000 a week and having it funded through the NHS. And making sure they're getting everything they're entitled to. A lot of older people are entitled to attendance allowance, and they don't claim it. The forms are 30 pages long, I think, and people look at it and they might have submitted the forms and they've been rejected, saying, no, you don't qualify. And people say, I just don't want to go through that again. Whereas advisors can help people say, no, we can sort of help you put that through, maybe use the services of Age UK or something like that. Make sure it's not going to fund all of their care, but the higher rate of attendance allowance is £82 a week. So it's just worth having, and it's going to contribute towards the cost of that care. So just checking all of that first before you get to, if it's established, yes, you are definitely a self-funder, it is costing £800 a week, then it's looking at, well, what strategy do we come up with? Do we use an investment strategy? Do you just want to keep it in cash in the bank? Do you want to look at a care annuity to see whether you want to cap the cost and bring certainty and peace of mind, etc.? So advisors still have a huge role to play at that, even at that point of need part of it, I think.
What about vulnerable clients? Because again, if you're talking pensions freedoms, vulnerable and insistent clients have been a huge topic. How about vulnerable clients in this context? What challenges do they present?
Well, a great many challenges really, but again we're back to sort of the duty of care, with a financial advisor looking after those vulnerable clients. Mentioned earlier about a power of attorney, but of course you have to make one of those before you lose mental capacity, and this is really, we're back to sort of the theme of planning early enough. And as we just said there, yes, it can be a difficult or delicate subject to broach with clients, but there is this duty of care to do so. So vulnerable clients, real key consideration for them. But I'd really say come back to the point of plan early before the person perhaps becomes vulnerable.
Yeah. If you are vulnerable and you haven't got anyone to help support you, then the local authorities now under the Care Act have to appoint an independent advocate to help you, through the system and all that sort of stuff. So,
what are hopefully some of this is prompting questions in your mind, so please drop those questions through, and perhaps there might be specific scenarios or specific product solutions that you'd like to understand how they interact with each other. I suppose we were talking before the session about some of the decisions that you could make which are effectively, they're almost irreversible, and they put you in a position where you would be funding, rather than, for example, the NHS funding, some of that care. So I wonder whether you could just talk about some of the pitfalls, some of the things to look out for that might actually put you in a position where those costs you become liable for those costs as a family.
Well, I think if I'm thinking what we were talking about earlier, you've got to decide, I think, if it's the point of need, you have to decide, or just generally, if going through, from retirement perhaps onwards, are you happy to meet the cost of care? If you've had a reasonably affluent lifestyle, because there are a lot of people that say, incredibly unfair, I'm going to give everything to my sons and daughters, and then I won't have to pay because the state will have to pick up the tab. There is a thing called deliberate deprivation, so you've got to be a bit careful what your intention is behind it. But if you've done it in plenty of time, then it's probably okay. But you then have to think, is that really what you want? Because there are other ramifications. If you're giving assets to sons and daughters and they get into problems through divorces and bankruptcy and all that, everyone loses out at that stage. So, it's a real problem. But you've also got to decide, if I've had a reasonably comfortable lifestyle, do I actually want to be in the hands of the local authority, who then say, we're paying for it, you're going here. And you go there and you say, this is not the nicest, I want to go tall trees up the road. And you go, well, they say, yeah, but that's £200 a week more expensive and we're not paying for it. So you then go, oh my God, what have I done? So at that point, you might regret sort of those decisions about giving away assets, etc. So it's quite a difficult one, I think, to, it's only you can decide that. And the other thing is that you're talking about powers of attorney. I think there is that potential for conflict of interest. Hopefully, most family members that are powers of attorney will only have mum or dad's interest at heart. But if they say, if you give everything to us, you won't have to pay, but when they come to put you in a home, we'll provide, we'll give a top up to provide a nicer quality one. But when it comes to it, will they actually do that? Or will they go, well, actually, Mum, that account's perfectly okay.
And also,
you just
there's
don't
a certain
know.
order as well. So if you are going to make gifts that are abnormal gifts to people, you have to do that before the power of attorney is in place, don't you?
Well, a power of attorney itself doesn't, necessarily give carte blanche, authority, because any decisions made have to be in the distinct interest of the donor. So there are obviously some cases of power of attorney being abused, but that's the overriding principle. So, if there's any aspect of gifting, for example, that really needs to be given serious consideration, because, as Graham quite rightly said, the local authority subsequently can look at that as deliberate deprivation. And it's not so easy as giving, gifts or assets away. And of course, most people don't necessarily want to do that anyway. They don't, want to give it away. They like to have control. But even so, but it isn't just simply passing it over that might not necessarily overcome the problem anyway.
No. I mean, you mentioned deliberate deprivation. I mean, traditionally, deliberate deprivation was gifting of assets away within a 2-year period. I've been hearing a lot more from advisors saying, with the clients, that local authorities have been challenging where gifts have been made way outside the 2-year period, but where the age of the client at the point of gifting was like in their 70s, and local authority have been challenging it now on the basis of it wasn't unreasonable to expect that if you give that money away at age 75, they might need it in the next 5 to 10 years, and they've been winning that. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I don't think there is a time limit as such. I think the issue really is at the time the gift was made, was the individual, fit and healthy, and was there no foreseeable need for care? But previous 2-year time limit, I think, is now gone. So the local authority can go back.
Yeah, they've got powers to go back as far as they want.
Yeah.
But it's also the intention. Why did you do it? So that's what you've got to look at as well.
Okay. That tension then between assets for you and assets for the next generation. Let's just talk about Iht planning and how important that is for an ageing population and intergenerational wealth. So, where do I start?
So Iht planning has been obviously quite topical in the press. A couple of things. Iht receipts have been rising at the highest ever level for the last 30 years. In 2014-15, they equalled the pre-recession all-time high of £3.8 billion of receipts. Every month's Iht receipts by HMRC so far this tax year have been at an all-time high, and if we extrapolate that for a whole tax year, we're going to see a 27% rise this tax year up to £4.8 billion. And that's not coming from the high net worth super rich people, that's coming from Middle England. Yes, it's being driven by house prices, by greater wealth investments, but also inheritances and the like. Now, of course, another great piece of headline-grabbing information has been since the summer budget about the announcement of the new residence nil rate band. And I'd actually suggest to advisors and to people that the majority of the UK population, because of the press coverage, has gone away one of two thoughts. Either now, as a couple, we have £1 million worth of nil rate bands, so actually we don't have to pay Iht anymore, or our house is now exempt from IHT. And whilst that is true in a number of circumstances, there is quite a number of criteria. So very, very quickly and high level, the criteria goes something like the house must have been a residence at some point in time. It has to be owned by you as at your date of death. It has to be passed to direct or linear descendants, which, although it's a growing list, is basically your kids, your grandkids, or your son or daughter-in-law. Okay. It's the value of the house less any liabilities that you can use against that residence nil rate ban. But of course, the residence nil rate ban doesn't start phasing in until April 17. So it's not in place here and now today, despite what the press may have suggested. And it won't fully be in place, funny enough, until April 2020. And interestingly, this April 2020 date is coming up quite a lot. And I think that's probably because there's going to be an election. So a lot of things, so we'll do that if you elect us again. If we don't, things could all change. So, there's a lot of carrots being dangled, but there's a lot of misleading information going out there. And I spoke to a lot of advisors who spoke to a lot of clients who said, well, I don't need to carry on paying my premiums on this whole of life policy now to cover my IHT bill. Well, wait a moment. You do, because it doesn't come in fully. What happens if you haven't got kids or you don't like your kids? You won't get the residence nil rate ban. And of course, there's a few other bits and pieces in there. For instance, if your net value of your estate exceeds 2 million quid, it will be tapered away to zero. So, people still need to do IHT planning, and I see IHT planning, it may only be 10% of all the states that pay IHT, but that's still 10 times more than it was back in 1988. Okay, so the point here is, if you're talking about retirement, you also should be talking about estate planning. That brings you into lasting power of attorneys. It makes sure you write a will. If you're talking about those things, you should also then be thinking about who am I passing my assets on to? Am I going to have an IHT problem? Okay, yes, I am. What are the implications of that? And one implication might be, well, if I'm going to have an IHT problem, do I do any separate long-term care planning, or do I actually pay for it out my estate because I'm going to save, or my estate's going to save 40% IHT? On the other hand, if I haven't got an IHT problem, I want to make sure as much of my assets pass on to my descendants as possible. So I need to have a will, I need to think about these, and I need to consider long-term care planning. So there is, there's almost like a flow chart of twists and turns. And of course, the final thing, is funerals. And people don't like to think about funerals. But the costs of funerals are rising. The average cost of funeral in 2014 was a touch under £3,600. The average cost of somebody dying, that's all of the costs incurred when someone died, dealing with the estate and stuff, was almost £8,500. And they've been increasing by double digits year on year. So, it is a booming industry, death, unfortunately. But people aren't funding for it. Less than 10% of people fund for it. Now, yes, there's a range of solutions out there, from what I would say are the unregulated funeral plans, which, although they lock in your costs, what happens if the funeral firm's not there in future? Then there's these guaranteed acceptance type plans where you get a free carriage clock or park a pen. The reason they guarantee to accept you is because they don't look at any evidence of health, because the premiums are higher. So actually, if you're a relatively healthy person, another option apart from just savings might be to do a guaranteed whole of life policy. Minimum premiums typically are about £20 a month, and you can fund for a sum assured that will cover your funeral costs. So, there are other ways of doing these, and everybody at some point in time will pass on. It's a fact of life, unfortunately. So there is a massive opportunity to discuss with clients, even if it's just directing other monies into different savings account for that, or doing whole of life to cover for that. So I think there's a massive area here, and IHT planning is but a part of it, but it is very important. And what I've been hearing from advisors is not only the misleading information that clients have, but as a result of that, some of them have stopped paying the premiums on their policy, and some of them have delayed following up recommendations from clients, not knowing they've got this exposure in the meantime. So really is something to focus on.
Some huge issues there. A rich vein, so this has prompted a few questions.
Okay, good.
First, Ivan, I suspect this one for you. So Rose Hudson, thank you, Rose. Rose asks, how will clients go about getting a power of attorney arrangement set up? Would they need to see a solicitor?
Not necessarily. We do them at APS Legal. So, in terms of how to arrange it, well, obviously, going through taking instructions in the same way of a will, but deciding who your attorney or attorneys are going to be. Very, very important decision that, because these are people that you need to trust implicitly, because they're going to be making those decisions when you're not in a position to yourself. That's the donor. But it's the Office of Public Guardian that issue the power of attorneys. Obviously, it's a process to go through, some forms to complete. Typically, clients, as we well know, don't like filling forms out. So, at APS we can do them on a client's behalf, or they can go through a solicitor or other means as well. So, since the OPG came into play, I think 2007, because that was introduced following the Mental Capacity Act of 2005, the OPG have tried to make it easier for people to obtain a power of attorney. It can be done online, but like with everything online, you need to know what you're doing to obtain one. So it's really much better to go through a route of getting some advice around it, just in the same way as if you were, taking out on a pension or investment.
Because I think am I right saying about the average cost that solicitor would charge for doing each individual lasting power of attorney is about £1,000 nowadays?
Well, it can be. Costs vary, and at APS, we put together packages. So, if a couple, for example, take a property and financial affairs power of attorney and the health and welfare one together, so they take out 4. We can combine and reduce some of the costs. And the OPG themselves have, registration fees. So, it should be relatively easy. Go to the right person to get that advice. Although it said it can be done direct, but not necessarily advised.
Yeah. Okay. A little question about no rate band.
Okay.
Will that new residence no rate band still be valid if passing to stepchildren? So this was your longer list.
Okay. So the longer definition of direct descendants is natural blood children, stepchildren, adopted children, foster children, those you've got legal guardianship over, or kinship if you're in Scotland. It will be the standard Act-based definitions of adopted children, stepchildren, foster children. So the simple answer is yes. As long as that meets that criteria.
Yep. So thank you, Jenny Fothergill, for that question. And now there's one that comes from Kevin Heedy, hope, pronounced that right, which comes with an apology to Graham at the end of it. You ready?
I can't read it. I can't read it.
So it says there appears to be a number of later life associations, so i.e. solo, etc. As an advisor who wishes to build my business in this area, which is great news, what are the benefits to joining these organisations, and if possible, which one is the best?
Well, as far as the recognised accreditation, which was put together by the Financial Skills Council, I think it's the Skills Partnership now, which is the recognised accreditation, is the solar one. It's the Later Life Advisor accreditation, and when you get that accreditation, you become a member of the Society of Later Life Advisors. So you're a solar member. Now, as far as I think because this is such a topical area, there are various other later life academies and things like that are out there, which are really good for providing you with perhaps CPD, supportive environment, all that sort of stuff. But the only recognised accreditation as such is solar, and the honorary president of solar is Lord Lipsey, and solar is the one that's going to be mentioned. It's been mentioned within the Care Act and the discussions, not directly in the Act, but in discussions that took place in the House of Lords and all those sorts of things. And also, I feel that all local authorities seem to be operating different ways. Doesn't seem to be any real consistency. But those that are proactively working with financial advisors are saying that we'd like to work with those that are solar accredited.
Okay.
So the other accreditations may be useful, but I'm not sure if they're recognised by entities such as local authorities. And the other professional connections, solicitors, accountants, are also now seeking advice. If they're working with financial advisors, they want them to be, in the later life market, want them to have the solar accreditation. So,
kind of mark.
I'm not saying it's not an easy thing to do. You've got to provide a certain amount of information in terms of your supportive environment, your CPD, and then there's actually a live interview which you'll have a discussion on. So you've got to have all of the technical knowledge, but then some of it is, as I mentioned earlier, it's the soft skills and how you impart that technical knowledge to people that are perhaps in a bit of a stress situation. So, but it is the later life advisor accreditation. So yes, it leans very much towards care, but it is that kind of at retirement, through retirement, the decumulation phase, I think was mentioned earlier, wasn't it? So I think that, I'm not saying any of the other sort of later life academies are I'm sure you can get some fantastic stuff, but the actual recognised accreditation is the solar one.
Great. Okay, thank you very much for that.
Is that all right?
That looks, well, Kevin, it's up to you really, isn't it? You can drop us a line if that doesn't cover it.
Or if you wanted to speak to me, you can contact me through partnership or whatever, and I can run him through a bit more detail if required.
I guess from each of your perspectives then, as we start to wrap this up, again, it's such a broad subject. So are there any areas where you feel we've not necessarily given due weight to sort of aspects or considerations for either product solutions or maybe even just pitfalls that advisors and their clients might face?
Well, I'd just like to sort of touch on one really, because we mentioned about intergenerational financial planning, and yeah, we need to give clients the right advice at the right time, on their journey towards later life. But when the time comes that people do die, and we're all going to be in that situation. So, as Andy said, there's things like funeral costs to take into account, but also probate services, and that's where something again we provide, with APS, and that again is important that families have access to that through their financial advisor. And the other thing, of course, is that it allows the continuity of the advice, and indeed, any advice over investments and wealth to that next generation. And I think, as Andy said earlier, we're looking at perhaps advisors are looking at giving advice to sort of the children of the current people in later life. And it's allowing, as I said, that intergenerational planning to take effect. So, please don't forget about probate services as well.
Probate seems to me to be an area that could, more advisors could be involved in probate. It's not great penetration yet. And so, I guess financially, what's the consequence of just defaulting to where probate might go? So a solicitor, the bank.
I mean, depending on what's in the will, of course, it depends who the executors are. But what we call lay executors might not even know where to start with the administration of an estate, and they might fall to a solicitor or a bank, for example. And to be honest, it can be quite costly, especially if banks, for example, are named as executors. So again, get the right advice. It can be done, say through APS or equivalent companies on a more cost-effective basis. And again, my just sort of plug really would be for advisors to be aware and have the facility, with the family when that time comes to have that, available for them to talk about.
That's a good shout.
I suppose from a Zurich's perspective, one of the things that we talk to financial advisors about to support, whether it be in the Iht planning, the funeral planning, and also to some extent long-term care, is through our guaranteed whole life policy. That can meet some of those needs, but it's one of the things we have been doing in recent months is we've been piloting with selected advisors a new later life flexible option on our guaranteed whole of life, which, to cut to the chase really, is should they not be able to do 3 of the 6 activities that they live in or have mental incapacity, it will pay out up to 70% of the sum assured for them to use on an array of later life care needs. Now, it is only a pilot. We will be reviewing that at the end of the year as to next year, but that is an alternative.
And what are kind of cost implications?
It will just be the normal premium for the whole of life policy. So if you die first, it pays out the full amount. It's a free option with no additional underwriting. So obviously, we will review the feedback.
Yeah, okay. And that's reflecting, I suspect, the fact that those decisions aren't necessarily being made. The planning is as you said, 10% of advisors are helping clients in this market.
At the point of need, yeah.
It's a heads you win, tails you win, because if you unfortunately die first, it'll pay out the full sum assured. If you go into care first, you've already funded through the policy, so you're not having to incur extra costs. So it's another area of a solution. There's multiple solutions.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. It's one of the things that we talk. Yes, we have our care annuity product, but when we're talking to advisors, we talk about the different options. So, and one of which would be the care annuity as an option. But you could use the deferred payment scheme, for instance, or you could use an investment strategy that funds the care. Obviously, there are pros and cons to each one of those options, And obviously with an annuity, you've got options within the annuity as well. So you've got the basic annuity, and obviously the risk there is if you die very early into it, then it's loss of capital. But you've got options to capital protect, and there's also a deferred option. So you've got different options to discuss with the client and decide, which is the best option for them if they want to bring a cap to the situation and bring certainty and peace of mind to the whole thing.
That's great. Thank you all for your time. Thank you very much for your questions. Obviously, if that last kind of flurry as well has prompted any further questions, drop them through and we'll be able to pick those up individually, and we'll make sure that we get expert responses to you. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found that useful, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.